Warhammer 40,000 Renegades, Lord of Excess by Rich McCormick. Chapter 25. Arcat awoke, though he couldn't remember sleeping. It was dark, but not so dark that he couldn't see. He was in a narrow space, like a cupboard or a cell. He lay on a hard cot, not quite long enough for him to stretch out entirely. There was a bucket in the room, that would explain the stench, and he saw lines of light, dim and green tinge that carved out the shape of a door in front of him. He rose, or tried to, his body tensed in pain and exhaustion, its every fibre strained. Suddenly he saw his old friend Sandpow in the gloom, killed by gases, the man's skin sloughing off to reveal a leering skull. He closed his eyes and banged his head with his hand, as if to shake the image loose. His other arm followed, involuntarily, and he froze as something hard and cold touched against his forehead. He opened his eyes and looked at his missing forearm. In its place was a long, serrated blade, attached at the stump with a series of straps and cables. He pulled at the foreign object, trying to pry it loose from his body, but a barbed metal wire looped over his shoulder, locking the weapon in place. The barbs were small, but they bit cruelty into his bare skin, drawing blood and causing him to gasp in pain. "Fighter needs a weapon," a sibilant voice said. "You had no weapon, so we gave you one. You are welcome." "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter," the voice said. "It is time." There was a hissing sound, more insistent and artificial than the reptilian voice. A sickly sweet scent crept down Arcat's nostrils and over his soft palate. He threw his hand to his face, covering his nose and mouth, as gas filled the room. "You can't wait forever, gladiator. Let the fury take you." Arcat held his breath until his lungs throbbed and his vision clouded. As human instinct took over, he fell to his hands and knees in the tiny cell. He sucked in fetid air and expected to die. Instead, he was baffled when he felt a wave of elation. His muscles, moments before so sore as to be almost useless, were now electric, tingling with sensation and power. His vision was sharp, clear. He could see the grate in the metal ceiling far above, through which the gas had been pumped. He could see the Vox transmitter that had been crudely welded alongside it, through which the voice had come. He saw the door move almost imperceptibly before it swung open. Light poured in, thin and cold, and Arcat saw an open space in front of him. It had been a manufactorum once, he guessed, but its purpose now was clear to his quickened mind. Chains crossed the walls, their links studded with wicked barbs. Blood stained the floor, arterial red, scab brown, and all the shades in between. Arcat realized he could smell the blood, the stink of iron and heat in his nostrils. It excited him. There was a sound, too, a dull, rhythmic thumping that was joined with a roar. He looked up. Above, arrayed around the pit, were hundreds of figures. He couldn't see their faces, but he listened. He realized he could hear what they were saying. They were chanting, all of them, all calling for the same thing. Blood. 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 He had killed for survival. Now he killed for vengeance. He had always had anger, burning at his core. How could he not? His arm, his calling, his family, his life had been snatched from him by the mutants and monsters. His saviour had damned him. He was good at it. He enjoyed the tearing of flesh, and the iron taste of splashed blood. He revelled in the moment of strength when an opponent's will was broken, when they begged for their life. He bathed in the worship of the crowd as he cut and smashed skulls. Why should he not take pleasure in killing? He didn't care who he killed. He fought all comers in the pit. Gases were common. They were easy prey for the hunter gangs that roamed the streets, tricking or snatching potential fighters like him. But more exotic creatures had felt the bite of his blade arm as well. He fought creatures from Serene's vast grasslands, felines and canids that stalked among the spears. Strangest of all were the pox people. They were pathetic things, gambling, slow-witted, barely able to raise their rusty harvesting tools as they came for him. He had put their blade through his stomachs and he had put his blade through their stomachs and turned to the crowd for their adulation. But when he turned back, the pox people had risen again. They came on until he separated their heads from their shoulders. Even then, their bodies staggered towards him, twitching and convulsing. They continued their inexorable march. The crowd roared in amusement, and for Arcat, revulsion gave way to pragmatism. They only stopped after he had hacked their bodies into small enough chunks, and the endlessly beckoning fingers and swiveling eyeballs too small to be a threat to anyone. He was sick for a month afterwards, his shoulders and back erupting with yellow buboes that the pit's chirurgeon cut out with a hot paring knife and no numbing agent. Arkat's world had contracted. There was the pit in his cell, and only occasionally the chirurgeon's chamber. He saw people as he moved between these spaces, strange people, wearing featureless masks of brass. They reflected the fires that burned in braziers, light flickering on the beaten metal. His shoulder burned with pain that the chirurgeon could not heal. It was red and raw, where the skin and muscle had started to fuse with the leather and the metal of the blade attached to his stump. He wasn't sure how it was happening, but he could feel through the blade now, with the heat of pumping blood as it ran along the sharp edge, the cold of the whetstone as he sharpened it before a bout. It wasn't just touch either. The blade had become a sensing organ, able to taste and smell the fear and fluids of his enemies. Every bit as valuable in combat as his eyes or ears. As though he had been returned to his cell once more, when his world suddenly expanded again. Sound was his first warning, a cacophony that woke him from a dreamless sleep. He could not see their source from his cell, but he knew the instruments well, their music etched into his mind, the acid fizz of las bolts, the crack boom of bolt rounds, and the wet thump of blades into flesh. This was no gang raid. The attackers were Xantine's own soldiers. He could tell by their weapons. Las guns rather than stubbers, slicing blades rather than blunt instruments. Rarefied stock. His suspicions were confirmed a moment later, when a man spoke, his reedy voice artificially projected by some device. "In the name of Lord Xantine," the man proclaimed, "you are to renounce your seditious activities and present your stockpiles of Solipsis sap forthwith, or you will be subject to summary execution." Arkat pressed his face to his cell door, trying to catch a glimpse of the battle above. His blade arm twitched, and he realized he was desperate to wet its edge with the blood of Xantine's lackeys. He cursed and smashed his forehead against the bars of the cell. "Let me out!" he roared. In cells nearby, he heard as his fellow gladiators took up the cry, some in fear, some in anger, some in mindless jubilation. But they were trapped, just as he was. Arkat saw brass-masked figures tossed into the pit, their black robes pooling like blood as they hit the gore-soaked sand. The soldiers had the upper hand. "Let me out!" he roared again. His own blood flowed from his forehead, turning his vision red. "Let me out!" There was a whisper, almost too quiet to hear over the cacophony. A sibilant voice, one that had given him his weapon, spoke. "Go, gladiator," it said. "Spill their blood and take their lives." The doors of his cell thunked open. The sound was echoed around the pit. The cells of his fellow gladiators split apart, revealing their prisoners. Arkat stumbled out into the arena, found himself standing alongside gases and monsters, blood-mad warriors and mortal enemies. Under normal circumstances, he would have killed them in a heartbeat, but in that moment, under assault from Xantine's thugs, they were all brothers and sisters of Serene, the true Serene, before the supposed saviour had poisoned his world. Bodies were piled up at the site of the pit, high enough to climb, and Arkat saw his way from this place. "What do we do?" a grotesquely muscled gladiator asked, his voice almost too low to hear. "Gladiators," Arkat called over the din. He raised his blade arm high, in acknowledgement of the bloodshed to come. "We fight." I have to say, this I didn't expect. Arkat the Gladiator. Arkat trying to lead a revolution for the Blood God. It's interesting. I'm curious to see what happens with this character, but I imagine it's definitely not going to end well. He's clearly tainted by chaos. Clearly. I question that he's going to live very long at this point. But we'll see. It's hard to really get a feel for his character, because I think of all of the characters, he has probably changed the most in the book. He's gone from this pious guy to this absolute berserker, high on stims. I guess he's the equivalent of a jackal for the World Eaters army, because he's meant to be a really big guy. But yeah, didn't see a very short little Arkat chapter coming. Still, and also he's not entirely mindless. I mean, he's losing a lot of his character. He is losing himself to his bloodlust, which is interesting in its own way. I suppose we'll see. We'll just have to wait and see. There's only one more chapter left of part 3, and then we have a 4th part, which I didn't actually know I didn't think there would be. So it looks like there's going to be some other big change in Serene in this final chapter of part 3 coming up. So I hope that you guys enjoy it.